Welcome to Budapest, the capital of Hungary, a truly beautiful city with grand buildings along the river Danube, friendly people and a history that stretches back for centuries. But behind this impressive facade, trouble has been brewing for some years now. The reason lies in the political developments of this country and in this man, Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister. Hungary, once hidden behind the Iron Curtain for decades, was seen as a hopeful young democracy after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, almost a model example. Since 2004, Hungary has even been a member of the European Union and part of many other international partnerships. But especially in recent years, the country has drifted further and further away from that democratic path. Through a series of new laws and constitutional changes, Orbán and his Fidesz government have weakened many democratic institutions, including the free press and the judiciary. Election laws have also been changed in favor of Orbán's party. More recent legislation has targeted universities, non-governmental organizations, and even the freedom of expression and personal rights. In the spring of this year, pride events such as Christopher Street Day were indirectly banned across Hungary. At the same time, corruption continues to spread across Hungary, and then there's also Orbán's clear sympathy for the Russian president Vladimir Putin. Some now even see Hungary's government as a real security risk. Some have even gone so far as to call the country a Trojan horse. And others are already demanding serious consequences, including, for instance, Hungary's removal from the European Union. I have to say, what happened here in Hungary is on my mind for a few years now. And that's not just because of Hungary. It's also because Viktor Orbán established some kind of a playbook here on how to dismantle a democracy of a country step by step. A concept that we also saw in other countries after he was elected. In Poland, for example, when the right-wing conservative PiS party came to power in 2015, the country saw a very similar reconstructing of the state, much like what had happened earlier in Hungary. To this day, Poland hasn't fully recovered from it. Even though there is a new government today, it is still working hard to restore the separation of powers and the rule of law. It's an incredibly difficult process. And the reconstructing of the state that we've been witnessing in the United States over the past few months in many ways also strongly echoes Viktor Orbán's playbook. For the new US President Donald Trump, the Hungarian Prime Minister is even seen as something of a role model. Today, I'd like to take a closer look at what happened here in Hungary in the past 15 years. How does this anti-democratic state transformation actually affect the country? What could the long-term consequences be? And could it actually be that Hungary has to leave the EU? Well, let's take a little walk through Budapest, Hungary, and let's find out. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Budapest, Hungary. Take a look at this. Doesn't it look beautiful? Yeah, many historical buildings. Okay, here's a construction site, but take a look here. Wow, stunning, right? Yeah, and the place I'm standing right now is also quite important because this is the so-called Kossuth Square. It's not only important because the Hungarian parliament is right beside it. No, it also plays a quite important role in Hungarian history. And I would say, let's go a bit back in time and let's answer the question how Hungary actually ended up politically where it is today. Hungary's history is, of course, a quite long one, and I won't go through all of it now. What matters most for us is the more recent past, especially the period after World War II. As I already mentioned at the beginning, for many decades, Hungary was known as a satellite state of the Soviet Union. After the war ended in 1954, the country was left in ruins and was politically divided. The Soviet Red Army occupied Hungary, and with that came growing influence from the Soviet Union. Over time, political opponents were gradually eliminated. By 1948, the communists had taken full control of the government. Hungary was drawn into the Eastern Bloc economically and aligned itself ideologically with Moscow. For a long time, the country was ruled by a man named Matthias Rákosi. He called himself Stalin's best student, and under his leadership, Hungary went through a brutal period. It was marked by political persecution, secret police terror, show trials, and near total control over public life. In 1956, however, something fascinating happened right at this place I'm standing right now. The Hungarian population started protesting against this unjust state, and all of that led to what is known today as the Hungarian Revolution. Inspired by similar protests in Poland, students and intellectuals first gathered on October 23rd in Budapest, including right here on Kossuth Square. Thousands of people took to the streets demanding freedom of speech, free elections, and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. What began as a peaceful demonstration quickly escalated. The Hungarian secret police even opened fire on the crowd, and the protest turned into an armed uprising. Workers, students, and soldiers joined forces and engaged in fierce battles with the secret police and Soviet troops. In the first few days, the rebels actually managed to take control of large parts of Budapest and other cities. Prime Minister Imre Nagy took office, promised democratic reforms, and even declared Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. But that hope didn't last long. On November 4th, 1956, Soviet tanks rode back into Budapest. The uprising was crushed with brutal force. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands were arrested and forced to flee. Imre Nagy was later captured, and in 1958, after a secret trial, he was executed. During these uprisings, the West played a quite inglorious role, at least from the Hungarian perspective. Many protesters had hoped that the United States or other Western countries would help them or support them or intervene somehow, but that did not happen. Military intervention, especially by the United States, was out of the question. The fear was simply too great that it could lead to a direct conflict with the Soviet Union, possibly even a nuclear war. For the people of Hungary, the lack of support was a bitter disappointment. Their uprising and their fight for freedom and democracy had been bloody, but ultimately in vain. However, after these uprisings, some things did change in this country. The following years in the 1950s are also known as the Guláš communism. Under the leadership of János Kadar, who was brought to power by the Soviet Union in 1956, Hungary slowly began to move away from extreme political repression. Those who stayed quiet politically could hope for a relatively free and economically better life. Compared to other Eastern Bloc countries, Hungary introduced cautious economic reforms. At the same time, it began to slowly open up to the West. Western consumer goods were more available in Hungary than in most other parts of the Eastern Bloc, and during this time, the population enjoyed a certain level of prosperity. Televisions, cars, and trips to other socialist countries, all of this became accessible for many Hungarians. But political freedom was still very limited. The media remained under state control, and open opposition was still forbidden. But also this period came to an end, to be precise, at the end of the 1980s, when the Soviet Union slowly fell apart. On the 23rd of October 1989, also Hungary proclaimed the Republic of Hungary and left its socialist past behind. Just a few months later, in the spring of 1990, Hungary held its first free parliamentary elections. This made Hungary one of the first Eastern Bloc countries to make a peaceful transition from one-party rule to a parliamentary democracy. Looking back, this period is considered quite special because Hungary managed this transformation quite well. For many years, this country was seen as an absolute showcase example and as a role model for countries with young democracies. The country quickly joined a wide range of organizations and alliances, including the Council of Europe and NATO, and finally, in 2004, the European Union. However, Hungary's socialist past still lingered for quite a long time, and that was felt especially economically in the following years. Especially in the 2000s, problems in the country began to grow. Unemployment kept rising over time, and many in the older generation struggled to adapt to the new economic conditions. While quality of life improved for many, it didn't improve for everyone, and inequality increased. In rural areas in particular, people were hit hard by the restructuring, and the privatization of state-owned companies led to massive job losses. And this situation led to new political upheavals in the coming years. Several Hungarian parliaments failed miserably, and in the mid-2000s, the situation finally escalated. At the time, the country was governed by the socialist administration of Ferenc Gyurcsány. He came to power in 2004 and introduced a series of reforms, including deep cuts to the social sector and tax increases, which hit many Hungarians hard. But things got even worse in 2006, when a major scandal erupted. In a secretly recorded speech, Gyurcsány admitted that his government had deliberately lied to the public about the true state of the economy before the 2006 election. This sparked massive protests and caused serious damage to the government's credibility. People felt increasingly betrayed by the political elite. Well, and this is where he finally enters our story, Viktor Orbán. In the 2000s, Orbán started to present himself as some kind of an opponent of the political elite and as the man who would finally bring stability and prosperity to Hungary. And these promises also led to an election win. At this point, Viktor Orbán is no stranger to Hungarian politics. In the 1980s, he begins his career as a young, idealistic freedom fighter. As a co-founder of the Liberal Party, Fidesz, he advocates for a democratic and market-based future for Hungary. In the early years after the fall of communism, he is seen as a strong supporter of Western liberalism and European integration. In 1998, he becomes prime minister for the first time, but loses the election 4 years later in 2002. And that's when Orbán's political transformation slowly begins. He reshapes both himself and his party. Over time, he takes a more national conservative direction, often speaking out against the old elites. And in doing so, he gradually regains the trust of the people. Following the political scandals in Hungary during the mid-2000s, Orbán and his Fidesz party score a stunning victory in the 2010 election. They are so popular that they even secure a 2/3 majority in parliament. But what happens in the following years even surprises Orbán's sharpest critics. If you have a 2/3 majority in the Hungarian parliament, you can not only push through laws with it, you can also change the constitution. And that's exactly what happens right after Orbán's election. Orbán's first reforms clearly aim against Hungary's existing democratic system. And looking back, they follow a pretty clever playbook. If you want to dismantle a democracy, the best place to start is the separation of powers, so that politicians can push through their decisions without anyone standing in their way. And that's exactly what Orban's new government begins doing after 2010. First, they pass a new constitution. It strengthens the power of the executive branch and weakens the independence of the judiciary. The powers of Hungary's constitutional court, which has been an important watchdog, are significantly cut back, especially in budget and tax matters. Another trick: Orban's government lowers the retirement age for judges of the Constitutional Court. This forces many experienced judges into early retirement. Their seats are then filled up by people who fully support Orban's party line. Well, and what's even more annoying than courts butting in when you're trying to make laws? Right, journalists butting in when you're trying to make laws. So Orban also starts going after the media. In 2010, a new media law is passed, considered one of the most repressive in Europe. It introduces a strict control system, including a media authority that is directly controlled by the government. The law hits Hungary's public broadcaster hardest. After the reshuffle, the public broadcaster consistently follows the government's party line. For example, protests against the government are either ignored by the TV or heavily downplayed in the programming. Private media also feel the impact of Orban's new policies. Many face financial troubles over time. This is largely due to a special tax introduced by Orban, targeting mainly large newspapers and broadcasters. Many eventually have to shut down or get bought out, often by companies close to Orban's government. A clear example is the closure of the largest independent daily newspaper, Népszabadság, in 2016. The paper, which had long reported critically on the government, is taken over by a government-friendly investor and effectively silenced. But free press is pressured in other ways too. A well-known example is the fate of the radio station Klub Radio, which was highly critical of Orban's government. In 2021, the station suddenly shuts down. The media authority had revoked its FM license. Officially, this is justified by alleged violations of reporting duties and programming rules, but critics see it clearly. The shutdown of Klub Radio is another sad chapter in Orban's anti-democratic media policy. Orban's action against the courts and the media, however, is just a very little part of this whole state transformation that happens here in Hungary for the past few years. Meanwhile, it also affects other things, for example, the electoral law. Since a reform in 2011, for example, the party with the most votes receives a disproportionate number of seats in parliament, which weakens political competition. Orban also made changes to voter registration and election organization that allowed Fidesz to target their supporters effectively, while the opposition often faced bureaucratic hurdles. Reforms like these have continued under Orban up to today. Just this spring, a new media law was introduced. It threatens media outlets funded from abroad with economic sanctions unless they submit to the agenda of Orban's government. And the reforms do not only affect institutions. The Orban government repeatedly took aggressive actions against minorities. For example, a law was passed banning books that discuss homosexuality or transgender topics from being offered near schools or churches. Elsewhere, these books could no longer be openly displayed in bookstores. The assembly law was also tightened in a procedure this spring. It now states that public gatherings must not violate children protection laws, which sounds quite harmless at first, actually only means one thing. Pride parades, like the Christopher Street Day for example, are no longer allowed in Hungary. The CSD in Budapest was actually scheduled to take place one day after the release of this video, during my visit of the city just a few days ago, the police announced the ban of the Christopher Street Day on their website. As of the editorial deadline of this video, it was still unclear whether the CSD would take place or not. The city's liberal mayor, Gheorghe Karacioni, had announced plans to challenge the ban. The interesting thing about this whole situation here in Hungary is it's all a bit abstract, isn't it? Well, if I walk through the streets of Budapest here and I talk to people and stuff, it's not that different from any other European country. I can also speak my mind freely here on this square and criticize Hungary's government, and I don't get arrested by the police. Hungary is not a dictatorship, it's an illiberal democracy, how Viktor Orban calls it. I don't even know if this exists anyway. But if you're not a journalist or a scientist or a judge or a minority, you might not even notice any differences in this country at first glance. But of course, Orban's politics also affect the normal population in Hungary. This is, for example, reflected in the country's economy. Since Viktor Orban took office in 2010, there have been clear signs of stagnation. The country struggles with high inflation and a decline in foreign investments, which slows down economic growth. The OECD's Better Life Index shows that Hungary lags far behind many other OECD countries in areas like environmental conditions, education, income and wealth, housing, subjective well-being and health. The average net household income per person in Hungary is about $21,000 per year, while the OECD average is like $30,500. Hungary also performs poorly in education. 82% of adults in Hungary have a secondary school diploma, compared to 93% in Poland, 90% in Slovenia and 94% in the Czech Republic. Hungary's healthcare system is also severely underfunded. Hospitals often face poor conditions, with dirt, broken air conditioning and emergency rooms unable to take patients due to lack of climate control. But perhaps the most visible problem in the country is the widespread corruption under Viktor Orban. According to the organization Transparency International, Hungary is by far the most corrupt country within the EU. The most economically influential people in the country are almost all closely connected to Prime Minister Viktor Orban. And all of that, of course, is also a big problem for the European Union. On the one hand, it's all about the money. In recent years, the EU has frozen billions in payments to Hungary to prevent the money from being misused. But on the other hand, it's also about the general idea of the EU. The EU treaty even includes a clause that sets out the fundamental values of the community. These include, for example, human dignity, democracy, and the rule of law. The big question is, if Hungary doesn't really care anymore about the EU's rules, why is it still a member of the EU? And could that possibly change sooner or later? Well, here it gets pretty complicated, because kicking a country out of the EU just for not following the rules wasn't really considered when the European community was founded, and it was never truly intended. So the Treaty of the European Union doesn't include a clause that would cover such a removal. But there are measures that come close to an expulsion. These are found in Article 7, which consists of 2 parts. There is the so-called preventive mechanism in paragraph 1 that authorizes the EU to act against threats to its core values. If there is a risk that a member state will violate these values, the EU can start a diplomatic dialogue. This process aims to solve the problem and prevent escalation. And then there is paragraph 2 that describes the sanction mechanism. This comes into play if diplomatic talks fail. The European Council can, by a 4/5 majority, determine there is a clear risk of a serious breach. Following that, sanctions including suspending voting rights can be imposed. However, for this a unanimous vote of the other member states is required, so this option is rarely used. But many experts now wish for this tool to bring Hungary back to a democratic path. The American political scientist Alexander J. Motyl writes in a recent opinion piece for The Hill, "There is a mechanism. All that's needed is the requisite political will or the realization that Orban is progressively transforming the EU into a laughingstock." According to Motyl, suspending Hungary's voting rights would bring several benefits. The EU could finally do what its member states insist on without Orban's unconstructive interference. And it would also send a strong message to other EU countries planning similar violations of fundamental values. Motyl believes that suspending the vote could lead to two possible outcomes. Either Hungary leaves the EU on its own, which would likely harm the country since it heavily depends on EU funding, or Orban is driven out of office by his own people and the voters. Others, however, see this scenario as dangerous. The legal scholar Derek Wyatt wrote in 2022 on the website of the London School of Economics and Political Science that expelling Hungary from the EU would probably not be in the community's interest. Hungary could become more authoritarian outside the EU and seek closer ties to Russia, he writes. All of this could be more problematic for the EU than dealing with Hungary as a rule-breaking and uncooperative insider. Wyatt says, the EU provides an exit route for member states if they want to take it. But if a member state has not taken that route, then the EU should not push it out of the exit door and deprive its citizens of their union citizenship, even if many of them are currently supporting a government that is a serial lawbreaker. National sentiments and national governments change, and the EU is in it for the long haul. One thing, by the way, should be mentioned. On some points, Viktor Orban and his government have actually made some concessions to the EU in recent years. In 2023, for example, the EU released around 10 billion euros to Hungary. The country had slightly watered down its controversial judicial reforms. On many other points, however, experts continue to see violations that simply don't fit with the European idea. Which means the future of Hungary within the EU is still a bit unclear. But whatever happens in the future, the people who might feel it most are, of course, the residents of the country. They, by the way, have always had some kind of an ambivalent relationship with their prime minister and with the EU. In general terms, Orban remains quite popular in Hungary, as election results in recent years have shown. There is, however, a clear divide between the more conservative rural population and the progressive city of Budapest, where Orban is less popular. At the same time, and that's quite interesting, Hungarians are strongly pro-European. The country benefits massively from EU membership, with more than 70% of the population regularly supporting staying in the EU. If Hungary were to be excluded from the Union or sidelined, this would likely have a noticeable effect on everyday life in the long run. A recent study by the organization Policy Solution has found, however, enthusiasm for Orban and his restrictive policies is slowly fading. According to a survey, a majority of Hungarian society now believes that Orban's government has hindered rather than promoted Hungarian growth. 2/3 of Hungarians think the system primarily benefits the rich and that only those with close ties to the government get ahead. People are most concerned about the state of healthcare, the dramatic rise in living costs, and corruption. Here in Budapest, you can definitely sense these political tensions. I stumbled into protests at least twice that were clearly against Viktor Orban and his policies. But there are also a lot of subtle signs of discontent. I found this ban sign in front of the parliament quite funny. E-scooters aren't allowed here, but neither is that chubby guy here in the middle. On other street corners, however, you can see the clear propaganda of the Fidesz party. For example, right here, there are large posters everywhere with negative sentiments against the EU and Ukraine. By the way, Hungary will hold elections again in 2026, and this election probably will show which direction the country will take in the coming years. But Orban, of course, has already prepared for this. Once again, the election law was changed last year, and surprise, Orban's party benefits from it. In the progressive capital Budapest, the number of direct mandates will be reduced from 18 to 16, while the number of mandates in rural districts, where Orban's party is more popular, will increase. This tactic is also known as gerrymandering. So, where Hungary is heading remains quite uncertain. But one thing is pretty clear. The path back to democracy for this country, if this ever happens, will likely be a very rocky one. Okay, it's dark outside, I'm back in the hotel, and that was my video about the complicated political situation here in Budapest, Hungary. Well, and that was not only my video about Hungary, this was also the first part of my new road trip series. You might remember it. Last year I went around the Baltic Sea with a car. This year I'm going to Southern Europe, and the Hungary video was the first part of this series. In the coming weeks and months I will show you a lot more videos from my road trip. I went to Austria, I went to Switzerland, I went to Slovenia, I went to Croatia, I went to Italy and everywhere along the road I found many interesting stories that I'd like to tell you in the coming weeks and months on this YouTube channel. If you don't want to miss that, then please hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. And if you'd like to support me and my work, you can also do that, for example, on Patreon, or you can become a channel member on my YouTube channel. Then you will also get exclusive stuff and new videos before everyone else. And if you liked this video, this story about Hungary, then please leave a thumbs up. And now I would say, have a safe journey. See you next time.